Good morning, my fellow Bali lovers and friends of Bali and my subscribers that live in Bali. Welcome to another episode of Bali News, the latest news from Bali. Well, today it's June the 7th, 2020, and there hasn't been a lot of news out of Bali this week. Apart from the beach is opening, then the beach is closing, and the beach is opening again. There's been a lot of confusion between the Minister of Tourism in Bali and the Governor, one making a decision to open the beaches, the Minister of Tourism that is, and then the Governor closing them the next day. But the latest report that I have is that some of the beaches are now open again to the public. And if you look at my Facebook page, you'll see a video on there of Canggu Beach being completely overloaded with tourists and the surfers getting out there and enjoying the breaks and the sunshine. So, welcome to another episode of the latest news from Bali with Mr. Steve.
Mr. Steve! Mr. Steve!
In today's episode of the news from Bali this week, I'm going to take a look at the prospects for when travellers and tourists can start going back to Bali, especially from Australia, Bali's closest neighbour and one of Bali's best supporters, plus a little bit on whether they'll open the doors to China. There's been a huge amount of conflicting news coming out of Bali in the last 2 weeks. Some saying it won't open till October, some saying next year, some saying July. But I found an article that is called The New Daily, and it seems to be the most pragmatic report I've seen. And it's called Back to Bali, Australia's favourite island is looking to a new era. Let's just scroll down here. When the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic earlier in 2020, Bali was identified as a potential hotspot for the killer virus. Now, more than 110,000 Chinese tourists arrived at Bali's airport between January the 1st and February the 5th, when visitors from China were banned. Now, that's slightly misleading because I did a video a while back about is Bali immune or not? And I worked out that between December the 1st and January the 23rd, and that's when flights from Wuhan were stopped, in that period of 7 weeks, a minimum of 6,800 tourists would have arrived directly from Wuhan. And that's a minimum. There's a potential of about 10,000 based on the capacity of the flights that were flying into Bali directly from Wuhan. So this is right in so much as February the 5th was the date that all the airport was closed to all overseas tourists, and sure enough there were probably 110,000 Chinese in that period, and but that's where we were talking about. I was talking about the Wuhan aspect and not just China in general, because the virus at that stage hadn't spread much further than Wuhan. Visitors from tourists of all nationalities were banned in March, but Balinese still gathered in their thousands at Hindu ceremonies to pray for the island's safety. Now, remember that there was a huge festival in March that still went ahead. Now, Bali's economy, as we all know, is highly dependent on tourism, and it's been absolutely gutted for the last few months. Let's just see if there's anything more interesting here. But the island has emerged relatively unscathed for reasons that continue to baffle people. Sure, they're not doing the testing that some countries are. New Zealand and Australia, for instance, have tested way more of their population per 1 million. The numbers are just way higher than Bali. But, Bali does have only 5 deaths, one quite recently, and but it's been very, very slow, and only 510 confirmed infections, 2/3 of whom have fully recovered, according to World O Meters. Now, this is about the Australian man who died on Wednesday, living in Denpasar, and they're still waiting on details on that one. Now, there's a lot of hearsay about why Bali hasn't been tragically hit hard, and we don't believe it's anything to do with heat and humidity and all that sort of stuff. I just believe from my analysis that I did 3 or 4 weeks ago that January, it seemed to have spread. A lot of people were having mild fevers, mild respiratory problems, headaches and all that sort of stuff. And my theory is that because the young demographic of Bali, the virus did spread asymptomatically through a huge number of the population. So hopefully that would have created a bit of herd immunity already, because those people would have developed antibodies. So the speculation on why is quite irrelevant, really, because we don't know for sure. Now, we all know that this is quite common news, that Bali is number 2 on everyone's bucket list to go and visit. And so there's a lot of news from Booking.com, Skyscanner and all those saying that in their surveys, people have put Bali down as a must place to visit as soon as they can, which is great news for Bali. But when is that going to happen? So no date has been set to lift temporary travel restrictions that prevent tourists from visiting Bali, or indeed for Australians to head overseas at all. Reports that suggest otherwise are false, according to Bali's Ngurai Rai Immigration Office and the island's tourism board. There's all sorts of health protocols and economic sectors, including tourism, that they've got to be worked through. And based on their current discussions, they're hoping to open in late July with a step-by-step process, probably starting with domestic tourism only. Now, I find that a little bit unusual in so much as a lot of the other islands surrounding Bali have got quite large cases of the coronavirus spread, especially in Java. So if it was me, I'd be looking and working with the Australian government to get a corridor with at least Western Australia first. You could do it state by state, possibly New Zealand, because New Zealand now is probably going to be the first country to actually wipe out the virus. But even so, that's going to take some months, and no visitor is going to want to go to Bali for a holiday, come home and find they're going to have to quarantine themselves for 2 weeks because of what the Australian government, health authorities and the New Zealand health authorities say so. So until it gets to the stage where that's not going to happen, no one's going to be going back in a hurry. There's a few reports here on the technology to make payments a lot more contactless and things, credit cards and apps to go to visit tourist places like the Monkey Forest and Ubud, Tanah Sea Temple, etc., etc. There'll be like a Bali app. Some stuff here on the restaurants and what they're doing. This is the Four Seasons near Ubud and how they're going to be reopening on July the 1st. That's probably a little bit optimistic, to say the least. And it's just interesting. The argument, however, is somewhat of a farce because hundreds of small businesses continue to trade in the Seminyak, Canggu beachside tourist areas. Didn't really know there was hundreds of small businesses, but certainly there are a few. Sort of every 100 yards you'll see one open, and in between them 20 closed. But they're saying here from restaurants and cafes to pool clubs, gyms and sunset bars, the only restriction being that they must shut at 9 p.m. It's a bit unusual when you're apparently trying to close down a coronavirus outbreak. It says here they cater mainly to the thousands of expats still living on the island. Last I heard there were 30,000 expats living in the Seminyak Canggu area. And that area might be a little bit wider for the 30,000, I'm not too sure, but there's no accurate data on that. So, Idayu Indah at the Bali Tourism, forgive my pronunciation, at the Bali Tourism Office said no decision had been made about when international tourists or when beaches might open. Now, I know some of beaches have already opened. If it all goes well with domestic tourism, Bali will tentatively open for international tourism in October. So when they say tentatively, probably means they're going to be looking at opening to certain markets only. Now those markets will probably be Australia, New Zealand and China, since China is probably one of the strongest candidates and get the biggest numbers, and certain areas of China seem to have the virus well under control. So where are these tourists going to come from if Bali does open the borders to tourism? Now, according to this article, the first country to recover from COVID-19, which is debatable, and the largest source country for tourists last year, China, is the strongest candidate. And Mr. Agung here says, we cannot predict the future, but I think it will be easier for Chinese tourists because they have a strong central government, whatever that means. But what we really want are Australians, because they love Bali, we know that, and they support all the small local businesses. We hope are going to talk to the Australian Embassy about opening a travel corridor. Well, that's what I just mentioned previously. That's where they need to be talking. But given the low testing rate in Indonesia, 1,100 per million, compared to 54, nearly 55,000 per million in Australia and New Zealand, Australia and New Zealand are unlikely to entertain the idea of a travel corridor in the near future. But things are changing quite fast, and New Zealand is going probably to knock it off completely by next week. So things could change. Let's just scroll down here. Many of our Australian followers on social media tell us they want to come back. Well, that's pretty obvious. Quarantine obviously will be the major deterrent. Nobody wants to spend 2 weeks holed up in a hotel room when they return to their country. That's why I mentioned that before. And the article finishes off here with a talking about Western Australia, because in Perth, I think there are no new cases at all in Perth at the moment. And people who live in Perth, it's such a short flight to Bali. It's like it's probably quicker to get there than it is to domestically go to Queensland or New South Wales. So the outlook's not looking fantastic, and I would suggest that given the changes that in the world to what's happening now with the coronavirus and people protesting the lockdowns and the quarantines and the draconian measures that a lot of governments are taking, and just to save their own tourism industries. I'm from New Zealand, and New Zealand tourism was our number one overseas earner, and that's obviously stopped, and now farming has gone back to number one because there is no tourists at the moment. It hasn't been for a few months, and unlikely to be for a few more months. The pressure might just go on a little bit to get the airlines going again, get the tourism sector operating again, and there'll be obviously this, quote, new normal, and which will probably involve all sorts of testing at the border, and some of these impractical ones like Bali was talking about, having a very recent negative test within 7 days of your arrival. That would be so hard to organise. Because one, you've got to go and pay for the test, you've got to get that, and by the time the results get back and you get on your flight, it's going to be a little bit of pressure in that week before you leave. So there's all sorts of parameters they've got to get through first. So that's the latest in the Bali news from Mr. Steve. Not a lot happening in the news at the moment, but things will change quickly, and I'll keep you all updated. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to get a notification of when I put up a new video, and I do appreciate all your support and all your comments. Keep them coming. See you again soon.